The sun hung low over the wide western plains, dust swirling in the air as wagon wheels creaked against the dry earth, and in the middle of that golden haze a stagecoach rattled to a halt outside the small town of Red Creek, its passengers weary from the long journey across unforgiving country, but none more shaken than the young woman who stepped down last, her eyes rimmed with tears, her bonnet slightly askew, her trembling hands clutching a small satchel that contained all she had left of her old life. Her name was Clara, and she had traveled hundreds of miles to meet a man she had never seen, a man she had agreed to marry, through letters, written in ink that smelled of dust and tobacco, letters that had promised her kindness, safety, and perhaps the chance of love, though she had no illusions left in her heart, after the hardships she had endured back east, after hunger and loneliness and betrayal had taught her that words were often fragile, things that broke like glass when you tried to lean on them. And so as she stood there blinking against the afternoon sun, unsure if she had the courage to face this stranger, who was now her husband by contract, the crowd parted slightly and a tall cowboy approached, his stride steady, his hat tilted low against the glare, his broad shoulders outlined against the burning horizon, like some figure carved out of the very land itself. His name was Jacob Hawley, a rancher who had spent years building a life out of nothing but grit, sweat, and prayer, a man who had asked for a mail-order bride, not out of desperation, but out of the quiet longing that crept into a man's bones when the long nights by the fire stretched to empty, when the wind whispered through the pines and reminded him that even the strongest need someone to share the silence with. And as he drew near, he saw her tears, the way her breath came in uneven gasps as though she was bracing for a blow, and he slowed, not wanting to frighten her further, then spoke in a voice as gentle as it was steady. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, holding her gaze until she dared to meet his eyes, and something in his tone, the calm strength beneath the words, broke through her defenses, though her heart still trembled, and suddenly all the rehearsed lines she had planned, words of gratitude, polite smiles, even the desperate attempt at looking brave, fell away, leaving only the raw truth of her fear and sorrow spilling through her eyes. Clara's tears thickened, blurring the wagon and the curious stares of townsfolk behind her, and Jacob stepped forward just enough to offer his handkerchief, but not so close as to corner her, and in that space between them hung the fragile possibility of trust, a possibility Clara did not know she could grasp. Yet her fingers reached out almost of their own accord, brushing against his calloused hand as she accepted the cloth, and in that simple exchange the journey of their lives together truly began. The rest of the world melted away as Jacob guided her toward his waiting horse and wagon, murmuring quiet reassurances, telling her that the land was harsh but the home he offered would be her refuge. And she listened, her heart torn between disbelief and a flicker of hope she was almost afraid to feel. For hope had betrayed her before, yet something about this cowboy's steady presence suggested that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The road to his ranch stretched long and dusty, and as they rode Clara stole glances at the endless fields, the cattle grazing against the backdrop of distant mountains, the wide sky painted with streaks of crimson and gold, and for the first time since she had boarded that stagecoach, she felt a stirring in her chest that wasn't fear, but something closer to wonder, though she quickly reminded herself not to trust it too soon, because life had a way of snatching beauty away just when one dared to believe in it. When they reached his homestead, a sturdy wooden house framed by weathered fences and the quiet lowing of cattle, Jacob helped her down and said softly, "This is your home now, if you'll have it." And those words, so simply spoken, carried more weight than any promise she had ever heard. For they were not dressed in false charm but offered, like solid ground after a long storm. And though Clara still trembled, though the ghosts of her past still haunted her, something deep inside whispered that perhaps she had not come all this way in vain. As night fell, Jacob lit a lantern and guided her inside, showing her the simple but warm interior, the table he had built with his own hands, the fire already crackling in the hearth. And though Clara's tears had not yet dried, she felt a fragile thread of safety weaving itself into her weary soul, a thread spun from the cowboy's quiet strength and the unspoken vow in his eyes that she would never again have to pretend to be anything other than who she truly was. And so the first night in her new home passed not in grand declarations or forced intimacy, but in the quiet miracle of two wounded hearts daring to share the same space, daring to believe that out on the wild frontier, where every day was a battle against the elements, they might also fight for something softer, something that looked suspiciously like love, though neither yet spoke the word aloud. The morning broke soft and golden across Red Creek, the first rays of sunlight spilling through the thin curtains of Clara's new room, and for a long moment she simply lay there, her eyes fluttering open to the unfamiliar ceiling, her breath catching as memory rushed back the stagecoach, the tears, the cowboy with kind eyes who had spoken words she had not expected to hear, words that had steadied her trembling heart like a hand upon her shoulder. "You don't have to pretend with me," he had said, and somehow those words lingered now like a lantern glowing faintly in her chest, fragile but real, and as she sat up, clutching the thin quilt against her, she felt the weight of the silence around her, a silence that was not empty but waiting, as though the house itself was listening to see whether she would accept it as home. Outside, the sound of boots on the porch broke her thoughts, steady and unhurried, and she knew it must be Jacob, already awake and tending to chores as the first light touched the land. And something about the thought that he had risen before her made her chest ache with both gratitude and uncertainty, for she did not yet know how to repay such steadiness when she felt so unsteady herself. She dressed slowly, her hands trembling as she tied the ribbons of her bonnet, then stepped softly into the main room, where the fire from last night had died to embers but the scent of coffee brewing rose rich and warm. And there he was, Jacob, standing by the stove with his sleeves rolled up, the morning light outlining the breadth of his shoulders as he poured the dark liquid into tin mugs, as though he had known she would come when she was ready, and had simply waited for her. And that patience broke something small and hidden inside her, a part of her that had always braced for demands, for harsh words, for disappointment. He handed her the mug, his rough fingers brushing hers briefly, and said with a small smile, "Coffee's stronger than I meant it to be, but it'll wake you up." And though the words were simple, she found herself smiling back, the expression strange and new on her lips after so many months of sorrow. And in that smile Jacob saw a glimpse of the woman she might yet become when the shadows of her past had loosened their grip. After breakfast, he invited her to walk with him out to the corral, and though Clara hesitated, the thought of staying inside with her own thoughts felt heavier than stepping into the wide morning air. So she followed him, her skirts brushing the dry grass as the land opened before her like an endless sea of gold and green, the cattle lowing in the distance, the horses shifting in their pens. And Jacob spoke to her not as though she were fragile glass, but as though she were already part of the rhythm of this place, pointing out which pastures would be grazed next, where the water ran truest in spring, how the mountains far beyond held snow even in summer. His voice was steady, grounding her, weaving her into the fabric of the life he had built, and though she said little, a breath she had been carrying since she left everything she knew behind. Later, when they returned to the house, Jacob paused at the porch and turned to her, his eyes searching hers with a gentleness that startled her. And he said, "Clara, you don't owe me anything but honesty. You came here because you thought you had to, but I want you to know this: if ever you feel you cannot stay, I won't hold you against your will." And those words struck her like lightning, not because they offered freedom, though they did, but because they revealed the depth of his integrity, the kind of man who would rather risk loneliness than chain another's heart. And Clara's throat closed with emotion, for she realized in that instant that he was not like the men she had known before, the ones who had taken what they wanted and left her with ashes. No, Jacob Hawley was different, and that difference filled her with a trembling hope she scarcely dared name. The days at Red Creek began to lengthen as summer deepened, and Clara found herself settling into a rhythm she had never imagined possible when she first stepped off that stagecoach in tears, her heart heavy with dread and sorrow. Yet now the mornings greeted her with a soft kind of hope, the air alive with birdsong, the scent of dew on grass, the creak of the windmill turning steady in the breeze, and each sound and smell reminded her that she was no longer trapped in the shadows of her past, but was slowly learning to walk into the light of a future she had not dared to dream. Jacob was at the center of that future, not because he demanded her presence or claimed her as a possession, but because he simply lived beside her, giving her space to breathe, to discover, to belong at her own pace. And in that freedom she found herself drawn closer to him day by day, like a flower leaning toward sunlight without realizing it. Until one morning, as she watched him repair a fence line, his shirt damp with sweat, his brow furrowed in concentration, she felt her chest ache with something she could no longer name as mere gratitude, something deeper and fiercer that scared her as much as it steadied her. And when he looked up and caught her gaze, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, she turned quickly away, her cheeks burning, realizing she had been staring at him far too long. That night, as they shared supper by the fire, Jacob told her stories of his childhood, of the time he had nearly drowned in the river until his older brother pulled him out, of the first calf he had raised with his own hands, of the day his parents passed and left him with the land that had since become both his burden and his sanctuary. And Clara listened with rapt attention, not because the stories were extraordinary, but because they revealed the layers of a man she had thought was made only of strength and silence, yet in truth carried memories, wounds, and dreams just as she did. And for the first time she allowed herself to tell him a little of her own story, not the darkest parts, not yet, but enough for him to hear the loneliness of her childhood, the betrayals that had carved deep scars into her trust, the reason why she had agreed to a marriage by letter, because in her heart she had believed even a stranger's kindness would be better than the cruelty she had known. And Jacob did not interrupt, did not judge, but simply reached across the table and laid his rough hand over hers, steady and warm. And in that moment Clara felt something shift, a piece of her heart unclenching as though it had been locked away for too long. The following weeks deepened that fragile bond, with laughter breaking through the walls of silence, with moments of shared labor that somehow knit their spirits together more tightly than words ever could. And Clara realized she was no longer pretending to be a bride, no longer playing the role expected of her, but truly becoming Jacob's partner, his equal in the quiet daily struggle of living on the frontier. And though she still battled the ghosts of fear and sorrow, she now had someone willing to fight them beside her. One evening, Clara stood at the hearth with her hands clasped, trembling at the sound, for storms had always unsettled her. But Jacob came to her side, slipping his arm around her shoulders, whispering, "You're safe here, Clara. Nothing's gonna take you from me." And the words struck deep, anchoring her even as the wind howled, knowing she no longer had to hide her fear, no longer had to pretend to be braver than she felt, because this man had already seen her tears and loved her not less but more for them. And that realization filled her with a warmth that no storm could shake.